Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. We'll just take a few minutes to allow more folks to come in, and then we will officially begin in the next 3 to 5 minutes or so.
Hi, Marisha.
Hi, Himsing, how are you?
Fine, thank you. And you?
Good, I'm well, thanks. It's good to see
Well,
you.
you know, I was looking for last time you gave me the telephone number of Niven, but I'm looking for it and I can't find it.
No worries. I'll send it to you again on WhatsApp.
Oh, it's on WhatsApp.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay, yeah. Then I thought I had noted it somewhere. It's okay.
No
It's
problem.
all
I'll
right.
send it to you again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar of our Global Plastics Treaty webinar series titled Finance and the Global Plastics Treaty. It's a pleasure to have you all join us here today. As more people come in, I request that you kindly introduce yourself via the chat. So we are ready to get into things. But before we do, I would just like to introduce myself. My name is Marissa Naidu, and I am the facilitator for today, as well as Gaia and BFFP Africa Plastics Campaigner. First, to start today, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping remarks. If we could just have a change of slides, please, Carissa. So for folks that are joining us, please note that we do have French interpretation available. And the way you can access this is by clicking on the 3 dots at the bottom of your screen and looking for the globe icon or the interpretation button and selecting the language of your choice, either French or English. And that will help you to access the language options. If you are facing any technical difficulties, I will encourage you to please message my colleague Carissa Mons, who is on this chat, and she will be able to assist you. The session is also being recorded, and both the recording as well as the presentation from today will be shared with you. So with that out of the way, I will maybe ask if we could stop sharing presentation and have a quick photo opportunity. And for those that are able to switch on your cameras, can I please ask you to do so we can just take a quick photo. It's always nice to see some fresh faces. I'll cue you as soon as we have more folks putting on their cameras. Thank you, Dorothy. Thanks, Grace. Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. Can we get a few more folks? Awesome, Waimi. All right, big smiles, folks, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more just for good measure. 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, we can now commence with our agenda for today. As I mentioned, interpretation is available. And I would like to now introduce you to our speaker for today. So if we can just screen that slide. Awesome. So I don't think our speaker is a non-familiar face. I'm sure all of you are probably aware of Jacob Kean-Hammerson. And he is our speaker for today. Jacob is a campaigner for the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA's Ocean Program, focusing on negotiations on a new global plastics treaty. Jacob joined EIA in 2021, initially working both across the climate and ocean campaigns. And before joining EIA, Jacob spent 4 years developing multi-stakeholder coastal ecosystem restoration projects around the UK. Jacob also holds a BSc in biology from the University of Sussex. So something we have in common, Jacob, is being biology nerds, which is awesome. And he will be taking us through finance around the Global Plastics Treaty. So just to give you a brief overview, the new global agreement on plastic pollution will essentially require financial resources in order to achieve its objectives. And this being a priority area for Africa, we thought it would be most apt for us to have a presentation or an engagement around finance and the treaty. So I would like to now hand the floor to you, Jacob, to take us through this very pertinent issue to the treaty process. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Marissa, for that introduction. Yeah, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk to you about finance and the Global Plastics Treaty. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I'll run through a presentation where some of this stuff may not be new to some of you, some of it may be new to some of you. So hopefully, by the end of this presentation, we'll all kind of have a shared understanding of some of these topics and leave a good amount of time for some questions or even a kind of discussion. So I'm going to share my screen, and then if someone could maybe indicate to me that they can see the screen.
We can.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, so finance and the Global Plastics Treaty. So in today's presentation, I'm just going to cover a few topics. Firstly, what does the existing financial landscape look like as it pertains to plastic pollution? What lessons can be learned from existing multilateral environmental agreements? What areas and types of financial assistance should be made available to support the implementation of the new agreement? And how could a new financial mechanism work? So just by way of an introduction, I just think what's first and foremost is good to all have a shared understanding of what I'm using the term finance to refer to in this presentation, because it can mean lots of different things. So what I'm going to talk about is the financial resources that will be mobilized at the international level to ensure that a successful implementation of the new treaty. And this, I'm using this definition because this will represent what would be the new, additional, stable, accessible, adequate, timely, and predictable. Lots of words there. And that's kind of a very common phrase you'll hear during the negotiations by countries talking about finance, is the need to create these new flows of financial resources. And that is one way to do that, is having a kind of global financing mechanism. So there are lots of other fiscal measures and financial tools that could be discussed in the context of the treaty that we won't necessarily be discussing today. And these are fiscal measures more likely to be adopted, I would say, at the national level for a country who's trying to implement the treaty, who would like to perhaps incentivize or disincentivize certain types of behaviors or plastic uses, or to acquire the funds at the national level in order to implement the agreement, or indeed use those funds otherwise. So they include, plastic fees, taxes or levies, EPR, philanthropy. It could be public-private partnerships, charges on types of products, like charging for plastic bag usage, which happens in the UK, for example, voluntary contributions, all sorts of various fiscal measures. But as I mentioned, we'll be talking about this kind of international funding. So the existing financial landscape has been looked at and studied quite a lot as to what is it about the current funding landscape that is or isn't working and allowing us to address plastic pollution. So there's various different sources of funding. So multilateral funding, and that's the financial support provided by an international organization that comprised by more than one country. There's bilateral funding, which is country-to-country financial assistance. The not-for-profit kind of NGOs or philanthropy donations, things like that. There's for-profit investments in capital, which puts it like a company may expect some sort of generation of profit from, for example, like potential infrastructure developments to then make money from that. There's the national level funding, either at a kind of country level or the municipal level for cities or different municipalities in your country may provide funding for plastic related abatement or mitigation. And then you have blended funding, which is maybe a combination of one or more of those types of funding support. So there's a big funding landscape out there, but UNEP has since 2019 has conducted a number of assessments of this funding landscape, which showed some of the quotes that you can see on the screen, which mention the lack of coordination and overall strategy, difficulties in meeting the requirements to receive the funding, or which another interesting one is funding being channeled through particular thematic focuses. So it could be ocean health or fisheries, and only being able to access the funding if it's related to that theme. So just to linger a little bit more on what these key challenges are, they can kind of be summarized as that the predictability and stability, the accessibility, the coordination. There is limited donor attention on certain sectors and sources. For example, textiles or agriculture does not receive as much interest or funding as perhaps fisheries or ocean marine plastics. And there is the lack of the sort of market-based private investment. So the overall, what we can understand is the current system does not necessarily lack the funds, but what it does lack is structure and coordination and towards the achievement of a clear objective, which I think is where you can start to see where the Global Plastics Treaty comes in, where it could perhaps provide that coordination and structure, as well as having a clear objective, which would be the objective of the instrument down the line. So next up would be, what can we learn from existing MEAs, and what do environmental agreements currently do in order to finance the objectives? So there are several different types of multilateral financing mechanisms. So the general trust funds, which are usually funds that's contributions that they're for specific institutional support to a convention. For example, the Secretariat or the Conference of the Parties, those day-to-day functionings, and these negotiated the contributions here on the UN scale of assessment. So the UN would assess usually done by the kind of GDP or other assessments on each country, and each country would be required to input to that fund on a kind of scale basis of their ability to deliver those funds. You then have specialized trust funds, which are donor driven. These are usually earmarked for specific purposes with restrictions on how they are, how the funds are allocated and in what priorities. There are program-specific trust funds, which can be partnership-based or donor-based. So these would involve a single theme responding to a high-priority global or regional need. And they may be established in a partnership base by key sponsors who are invited to attend, or if it's a donor base, this may be kind of focused by the donor body. Then there is a multi-purpose multilateral fund. These are ones that you may have heard more about. For example, the Global Environment Facility Trust Fund. And this is a fund, it's under more than one multilateral environmental agreement. And the size of the fund is negotiated and agreed between the donors. And it would have its own governance structure and operating procedures, and it would have a kind of multi-purpose function. And finally, a dedicated multilateral fund, which would be tailored to the implementation of a single multilateral agreement. And it would be negotiated and replenished according to a scale of assessment, with contributions usually allocated to the priorities and activities that are collectively determined by the governing body of the agreement that it is trying to achieve. So I know that was quite a wordy summary, but I think it's useful to look at these different types of funds and really kind of understand, particularly when you may go out and be having your conversations with delegates or with other people, kind of knowing what these different funds are and what they're set up to do. So moving on, continuing in the kind of theme of what we can learn from different multilateral environmental agreements, I'll just talk a little moment about the multilateral fund to support the Montreal Protocol. So the Montreal Protocol was agreed back in the 1980s, and it was set up to address the kind of ozone crisis, where the use of CFCs and ozone depleting substances were causing a hole in the ozone, which could have had like very dramatic and cataclysmic environmental and human health impacts. So within the Montreal Protocol, it agreed to establish a financial mechanism which would enable the compliance of parties. And that the mechanism includes this dedicated multilateral fund. And the fund operates under the authority of the parties, which is a key point, is that the parties can, by their decision-making, prioritize different areas of where funding should go based on the evolving development of the knowledge of the hole in the ozone layer, or indeed any future amendments of chemicals or substances that would seek to regulate. The fund provides financial and technical cooperation to developing countries. So these developing countries are listed in Article 5. They'll often be referred to as A5 parties or A5 countries. And this was to enable their compliance. And this was done so that no matter the financial or fiscal challenges that a country may have, it would still be able to comply with and meet the objectives of the agreement. So it was determined that the ozone layer was such an important crisis that parties would need to be able to ensure that other countries could comply with this regardless of their fiscal circumstances. And so the resources would meet all agreed incremental costs of compliance, so all the additional costs associated with complying, and certain enabling activities to help countries with the institutional ways to comply with the agreement. So this was a key part of the Montreal Protocol when it was agreed. So the question would be, has it worked? So the Montreal Protocol is widely considered as one of the most successful international agreements certainly one of the most successful multilateral environmental agreements ever. That's the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, kind of has highlighted in the past how successful the Montreal Protocol is. So over the term of the Montreal Protocol to date, it supported 148 parties and provided almost $4 billion in project funding and capacity building to parties. This has facilitated more than 280,000 ozone depleting tons of ozone depleting substances. So it's reduced the consumption by 280,000 tons, and it's reduced the production by 188,000 tons. It's facilitated that reduction. If you think about the value for money, the global phase out of just CFCs has by 2060, it would be projected to have had $1.8 trillion of health benefits to globally, and $460 billion of avoided damages to agriculture, fisheries, and materials from the kind of damages that a hole in the ozone layer could cause. And if that's not enough, it's also avoided as much as 2.5 degrees of global average temperature warming by the end of the century, which is in a world where every fraction of a degree counts, that is a very significant amount. So it's been an incredibly successful agreement. And that is for a number of reasons. I wouldn't say here that it's the only reason is the multilateral fund that it has, but I think it's important to recognize that we can learn from the what we take as much as we can from the Montreal Protocol and learn. So when it comes to the multilateral fund, a UN Joint Inspection Unit review showed that most, if not all, MEAs, with the exception of the Montreal Protocol, do not dedicate enough resources towards capacity building. And capacity building for governments and countries is a key way to help them move towards compliance and implementation. And then there's a previous report along the same lines, talking about the financial assistance provided by the MLF, which refer to it as an exceptional but tangible example of a model, a financial mechanism to fully meet the incremental costs for normative activities. So we can clearly learn a lot from the fund and apply it in the best way we can to the new Global Plastics Treaty. So I'm going to move on now to what type of activities may need to be funded in a plastics treaty. So the first and very easy one would be the secretariat. So the day-to-day operations, so salaries, an office, conferences, travel, communications, all of those kind of things. As mentioned, this could be done through a general trust fund, where each country contributes an amount based on their scale of assessment to cover the day-to-day operations. And you can see the Ozone Secretariat, for example, costs around $5 million. The Basel Secretariat, some way below that, same as Minamata. And you can see the UNFCCC has a very expensive secretariat, but it's doing a very big job. So that is something that would need to be funded regardless. I don't think that's not controversial in particularly. But now we move to some of the costs that perhaps are more likely to be negotiated. So I'll kind of give you these. They can be broadly put into what I would call three categories. So the first category I would call, would be the enabling activities. So these are the activities or the actions that need to be taken to enable a country to comply with the agreement. So when we talk about institutional strengthening, that's the ability of governments to perform their essential functions. And this really, in the context of the Montreal Protocol and most places, refers to having a consistent and dedicated staffing within the government, e.g. like a plastics focal point to that is their job to comply with this to support the country comply with this new agreement. Capacity building and training are about providing the skills, knowledge, and tools to the individuals and governments to implement their obligations and commitments competently and with greater effectiveness. So plastic is a very wide-ranging product in our economy, and promoting a safe circular economy will really need a lot of capacity building and training for any government, full stop, I would say. But then it could also support performance management, partnerships and collaboration, professional networking, advocacy and negotiation, communication, access to information, those kind of things. Just running through them, policy development. So at the heart of this global agreement will be a country-level plastic pollution reduction plan, either a national action plan or a national implementation plan, and getting those international obligations into national policy, that you can provide some kind of funding and support and capacity building to help countries develop these national action plans, or indeed EPR schemes or things like that. Enabling activities could also include supporting the monitoring and reporting of the activities and developing pilot and demonstration projects that could be then implemented into larger projects in the future. So those are your kind of enabling activities. Again, slightly less controversial, and enabling activities are really key into helping countries get to the point where they are compliant. And next are the incremental costs of compliance. And these are the costs, the additional cost it may cost a country in order to comply with the new commitments. So just to give you, try and be as clear as possible, I'm going to try and give you a little example of what this might mean. So say a country is a producer of a product that has been identified as a cause of plastic pollution. So I've given an example that there is a washing machine. You can imagine perhaps a washing machine is leaking lots of microfibers during its process of washing your clothes. And next happens is the Global Plastics Treaty comes in, and the Global Plastics Treaty now has measures to reduce the loss of plastics through these products. So you will now need to change your manufacturing in order to become compliant. Otherwise, you will not be meeting your international obligations. So the country that has this manufacturing plant would then incur various costs in order to do this. It may have to research and develop new technologies for this washing machine. It may have to retrain all of the workers in the manufacturing plant of how to manufacture a product that isn't leaking plastic. You may have the cost of technology transfer from another country, or the conversion of the factory or manufacturing facility in order to be able to produce these new washing machines, which may also mean that the operating costs are more expensive. So as you can imagine, this could create a significant financial burden on a country if they don't have, like a developing country or economy in transition may have, that's a significant financial burden. In the world where there are incremental costs, there is a plastics treaty which meets the incremental costs of compliance. This country, when creating its kind of plan for compliance and looking at the increasing costs, they would create a plan and a list of those costs and what the difference is. And if the plan was provided appropriately and was agreed to, then they may receive some funding in order receive the funding, the differential costs to allow this transition in manufacturing. And ultimately, that results in a manufacturing plant that is now manufacturing products that aren't contributing to the plastic pollution crisis. So I very much hope that kind of gives you a kind of, I guess, a clear idea of what these incremental costs could be. So that's in manufacturing. Similar things could be imagined if you're producing plastics, some cost, like the change in production or early redundancy of those facilities. Those could also be incremental costs, for example. And I can point you in the direction of some where you can kind of look at indicative costs of incremental costs. These in the treaty have not yet been discussed at all, but that people have discussed the need for these costs to be covered. And you will note also that it's obviously very tied to what the obligations and control measures are. So it's very closely linked to those control measures. And finally, what are the other costs? This is a kind of the second category. So these ones that may not be directly related to complying with the agreement, but do relate to ending plastic pollution, the overall objective, or they haven't been covered by the incremental costs that I mentioned earlier. So this could be the development and running of waste management infrastructure. So that is an example, I would say, of something that may not be covered by incremental costs, or public information and awareness education, or developments in potable water or sanitation in some parts of the world could be an example of that's related to plastic pollution tangentially, but not necessarily the objectives of the agreement. So we have to also find a way to cover these costs as well. So if you just look at the zero draft of the instrument, there are a huge amount of control measures. I'll use this fancy laser pointer here. So all of them could, in theory, accrue incremental costs of complying with new chemicals and polymers of concern, international law, or new product design requirements could incur an increased cost. However, it's important to remember that this is a negotiation. So even if there is an agreement by donor countries to cover these costs, they may not want to cover the costs of waste management around the world, or the costs of non-plastic substitutes, just as an example. So there also needs to be a degree of prioritization of these costs as to what are the most important costs to be covered by this new predictable and stable funding, government to government, and what are the costs that we can look outside of the box and look elsewhere to cover. So one way that you can potentially look at it is at the waste hierarchy, or the zero waste hierarchy, which provides a kind of priority order of action to reduce waste generation. And in the so, for example, you could imagine that prevention and preparing for reuse could be, if there is only a limited amount of funding available, or a limited amount of will for donor countries to provide these funds, prioritizing prevention and preparing for reuse could be, for example, one way you could look at it. But then the question would be, where will the funding come from for recycling or waste management, recovery, etc.? So that takes me slightly on to Ghana's global plastic pollution fee proposal. So what does it seek to do? Well, the GPPF seeks to close the gap between the amount of plastic waste generated and the capacity to safely manage it. And what the GPPF would do is countries where primary plastics and polymers are produced, they would levy a fee or a tax on the plastic produced within their jurisdiction. So it would be a global agreed rate, but it's very rare for a tax to be levied at the international level. So each country would have to implement it at the jurisdiction. So they would be the sort of the tax collector, as it were, on behalf of the global agreement. And then countries would collect those revenues, as I mentioned, and some of them would be used to support the implementation of the agreement. So those revenues, they would go into this fund, and some of them would be retained by the country for the administration, and it being a kind of jurisdictional fee, they could then take that fee and spend it on kind of national priorities. So what are the potential benefits of such a fee? Well, it's a very clear expression of the polluter pays. What we've been talking about previously is maybe government to government financing. The governments, particularly in like in Europe, for example, I can tell you that they are very keen for polluters to pay. So this is a very good opportunity for the people who are producing the plastics to be held financially and fiscally accountable, no matter for the plastic and pollution that's produced, no matter where they are jurisdictionally. So they would receive this fee no matter what. It could cover the costs that governments don't want to cover. And the coordinated nature of it means that if it's all a flat rate, it's not going to make one country cheaper or one country more expensive. It's the plastics. It's going to be a kind of base rate globally. And another potential benefit is that also this fee, while also being a kind of financial measure, could also act as a control measure by increasing the cost of primary plastic production and therefore disincentivizing its use. But it also has some challenges. So the two main ones being the buy-in from producing countries and issues of sovereignty. So asking one country to levy a tax on its within its kind of sovereign borders and then mandate that tax then goes into a global fund, that is quite a tricky thing to do. So it will require some careful and delicate negotiation. But that is a challenge that we have to recognize. And, if the buy-in from producing countries, if you don't want to stop production, you may also not want to levy taxes on that production. It's going to make your plastics more expensive. So again, it's very similar, I guess, at large to the sort of dynamics at play that we see generally in the Treaty of Ambition and Non-Ambition. So I've kind of gone through quite a lot, I think, on the different types of funds, different types of costs to be covered, and this global plastic pollution fee. So trying to bring it all together, what could the structure of the financial mechanism in the treaty look like? So we have the zero draft. So this screen here is what the zero draft currently suggests, the sort of options. It's a dedicated fund, an existing fund, and the global plastic pollution fee, the Ghana proposal. But we would suggest that perhaps this doesn't have to be an either or situation, because we noted the huge amount of costs that might need to be covered to support countries to comply with the agreement. So actually, you could have a financial mechanism that encompasses all of these things, has a dedicated multilateral fund. It has access to JEF or existing funds. And it also levies this global plastic pollution fee. And at this point, you could start to see how we could mobilize these resources, vast amounts of resources at a global level. And when we think back to the challenges I mentioned previously, the challenges were the lack of coordination and stability and predictability, which this overarching financial mechanism could provide. And then what costs could these different areas cover? So, for example, a dedicated multilateral fund, the government funding, the new predictable, adequate, stable funding could support these enabling activities, funding, focal points, helping with policy development, helping with national plans and monitoring reporting, and the agreed incremental costs that could provide that real stable funding to help countries comply with some of the most priority aspects of the treaty. Then with Jeff, which is a kind of very much on the minds of donor countries who don't want to create new funds, we could suggest that we could solve the issues of coordination and access to Jeff funds and support projects like the establishment of separate collection or other waste management infrastructure, and potentially things like remediation. Then you also have a global plastic pollution fee, which part of the proposition by Ghana is that this would cover waste management to bridge that plastic pollution gap. And it could mobilize a significant amount of private funds to do so. And then also, I would be remiss to perhaps mention a plastic pollution trust fund, which has been proposed by lots of small island developing states, which would be to support remediation or chronic spills or chronic spills of pellets or plastic pollution that occur. For example, many of you will be familiar with the Express Pearl disaster in Sri Lanka, and that Sri Lanka were left with the costs of cleaning up a lot of this, whereas a trust fund that would be created could allow countries to seek those funds to remediate that plastic when a kind of chronic spill event does occur, for example. So this is, I suppose, a potential proposal or a kind of thought piece of what the financial mechanism could look like, to incorporate all these different options and all these different costs that could be associated with the treaty. So I think I feel like I've taken you all on a relatively long journey there into financing the Global Plastics Treaty, and I hope to have given you all a good understanding of the kind of financial aspects to the treaty. So I can ask you now for any questions, any thoughts, and also thank you all for listening and coming along. And I'm just always happy to be invited and delighted to be able to work with you all in any way. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I think you took something that was relatively complex and really broke it down really well for us. I was, quite impressed, or it was very insightful to know about the incremental costs and the way you sort of broke it down with the washing machine scenario. I think that was a good job done on your side. So thank you so much for taking something that is quite complex and making it easily digestible for all of us here. I also just see some appreciation for you in the chat, so thank you folks as well. I think there might be a question here from Douglas. Douglas, would you like to perhaps unmute and directly ask your question? If you are able.
Thanks, Marisa. Thanks, Marisa. Thanks very much, Jacob, for the presentation and giving us the insights into the financing. I was just wondering, when I was listening to the presentation, You mentioned, and it was very clear that the Montreal Fund has been, reasonably successful. I was just wondering, can't we, civil society and other stakeholders, push for similar kind of fund or something close to it in the plastic treaty? Because there are other options that have been availed. Why don't we take something that is already working and maybe improve that?
Thank you, Douglas, and good to see you, my friend. Yes, I think we certainly think that the inclusion of a dedicated fund as part of the financial mechanism, similar to the Montreal Protocol, would be a very important step towards facilitating like the necessary flows of finance from donor countries to recipient countries to help them implement the agreement. So we think, at least the EIA, that the dedicated multilateral fund should form a really core piece of this financial agreement, and using the structure of the Montreal Protocol would be a very good example. But I think I would say maybe not but as in addition, given the scale of plastics and how many different activities could be taken, there will need to be a large mobilization of resources. So we will also need to look at getting polluters to pay and accessing these existing large funds. But absolutely, Douglas, you're right. I think a dedicated fund in the start of the Montreal Protocol would be a kind of a cornerstone of this potential financial mechanism.
Okay, thank you so much for that response, Jacob. And I hope, Douglas, that answers your question. I'd just like to give the floor to anyone else who would like to also ask a question. I see one from Dorothy. Dorothy, would you like to also unmute? And then perhaps Grace can go thereafter. Are you?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. So, Jacob, I wanted to know if you know how countries currently contribute to the GEF, whether it's a percentage or it's voluntary, because my thoughts are what we could say is based on the argument of Ghana, that a country will pay taxes to its national jurisdiction, and based on the number of companies that are contributing to plastic, so that's production of polymers or products. So they count the number of industries in the country. So there are 50 countries are taxed, 50 companies are taxed, and then a certain percentage based on the number of companies in that country are contributed into the dedicated fund. And so I wanted to know if there's a structure already, or this is what you meant, that there's no structure and therefore there will be no way to even tell how money from the taxes is contributing to the dedicated fund.
Yeah, so I think at the moment, I think regardless, like you said, that there currently isn't a sort of coordinated structure for plastic pollution. There isn't one single window, I guess, for countries trying to access these funds for there's this kind of very disparate landscape. And if the Ghana proposal was to be implemented, then there would need to be some sort of executive body and secretariat to administer those funds. So the Montreal Protocol, for example, the MLF has its own secretariat as well as the Ozone Secretariat. There's separate things. And there is an executive committee of member states that sit on that executive committee, which review the funding. So in the kind of financial mechanism, looking at that, you probably would need something similar to look at that. On your question related to Jeff, I think there's about 40 different donors that have donor countries. I think, yeah, so there is Jeff has kind of meetings and like kind of COPs, similar to COPs, and that's where the kind of fundings and replenishments are decided and the donor countries. And I think, imagine that I don't know, I'm not entirely sure, but for example, I'll just use the example that I know well, the Montreal Protocol, it agrees the amount of money that is needed to fund. So they will say 460 million is going to be needed for this next step in the phase down of ozone depleting substances and HFCs. So that's the number. And then the UN scale of assessment will take all the countries that are listed as donor countries and say, the US, you have to contribute this much. Germany, you contribute this much, UK, and then everyone gets a chunk based on their GDP, except the US in the negotiation said if they were to be assessed scale, they would be contributing something like 30 to 40%, I think. This is just rough numbers, but they negotiated it that no one country can contribute more than 25% or something. So it's all a negotiation at the end of the day about who contributes how much and when. So that would be, I imagine that Jeff maybe has a similar process. But I don't know if Andres may know or works with the Jeff more closely.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jacob. Are you trying to give the floor to Andreas, who has his hand up at the moment?
He's got his hand up. I don't know if that was a direct response or just a question.
Andreas, do you have a direct response or?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Thank you so much, Jacob, for your excellent presentation. Honestly, as Marissa said, you really made very complex information and portrayed it in such a simple way. So that's very useful. And I wanted to ask you, based right now, you have a pulse understanding of different negotiating positions, of different stances, right, by countries.
Sorry, Andrea. I'm so sorry to stop you. We just have a stack of questions. So if I could just get to the folks that came before you, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, I'm so sorry to cut you off. Okay, I just want to quickly give the floor to Grace, then Kwame, and then we have Andreas after that. I'm so sorry about that, Andreas. I hope that's okay. Grace, would you like to ask your question? If you are able to unmute, but maybe I could just ask it for you in the interest of time. Okay, so Grace's question, Jacob, is, are you targeting known brands or all brands to pay?
So for a globally coordinated fee for the producers, that would only be the companies that are producing. The proposal, at least from Ghana, is that it would only be countries that are, or companies that are producing plastics, primary plastics. So it wouldn't be like fast-moving consumer goods companies or even like plastics converters that are taking the raw plastics and turning them into bottles or plates or whatever. It would just be those that are polymerizing the plastic, creating it as a material for the first time. And that is a very small number of companies globally, actually. Something I think is maybe, I want to say around 100 companies globally that are actually producing plastics. So it's the simplicity of the proposal is that at that level, it's not so complicated. But once you get down one level from those who are producing the raw material to those who are using that raw material to make products, that immediately proliferates into thousands of companies globally. So it would just be at that very upstream level. I hope that answers your question, Grace.
Thanks, Jacob. And I do hope it answers your question, Grace. I see also a question from Kwame, and then we'll take Andrea's question, and then lastly, Justice. Kwame, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you, Jacob, for a wonderful presentation. It's very insightful. My question is simple. I wanted to know, given the proposal from different angles, do you think where CSOs should stand to support? So when it comes to some of these proposals that it's being given, what do you think that we as CSOs can support or put our support to when it comes to such proposal that is given out? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kwame. That's a great question. Really good question, because I think in the context of in Africa, the Africa group is already very supportive of having a fund and access to and ensuring these finances are like support the implementation. So they are, I think, in terms of the advocacy angle, it would be less about convincing them that we need this fund or that fund. I would say I would say as civil society, what we would be looking to prioritize now in the conversations is what is going to be funded and what is the priority. So what do we think are the most important things in order to prevent plastic pollution? So that's what I kind of gave the example of the waste hierarchy. And is it mobilizing resources to cut production and change product design in ways that plastics are more reusable and exist in the economy longer or whatever, or transitioning away from manufacturing plastic products? So those are the types of questions I think we need to think about and answer is, what are the most important things to us that are funded and covered under the new agreement, and then start, because not everything will get funded in a dedicated fund or whatever. So I think it's those are the types of questions, and I couldn't say for you and your own priorities and what's the most important aspect of it, but I would say that's the question to get you there. But thanks for the question. It's a really good one.
Thanks, Jacob. And thank you, Kwame, for that great question. I will go on to Andreas and then Justice. Andreas, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Marissa. Jacob, I think you've answered my question on the previous responses, so thank you for that. And just to also say that if you see a need for better conversations between the CSOs that are working on the finance side of analyzing the zero draft, etc., and the delegates that you've identified to be potential middle movers or advocates or champions when it comes to incorporating the three pillars of, like the dedicated fund, the JEF, and also the Ghana's proposal, then I think Kuno can play a role there. So I think it would be useful to have a conversation as to whether that is a space that would be needed by the coalition and also useful from the point of view from EIA on whether that broader communication can be useful in our advocacy aims. So yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thanks so much, Andreas. I'm not sure, we are slightly over time, folks, but if you could bear with us for another 3 or 4 minutes so we can allow Justice, and I think we'll take a last question from Ahmed. Justice, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm there, Marissa. Are you getting me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Please
hi,
go
Marissa.
ahead.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Jacob, thanks for your insightful presentation. It's been quite enriching. I just have 3 concerns. The first is with respect to the extended producer responsibility. How do you envisage this at the global level, and who are the companies that we are going to target? Is it like looking at fossil fuel producing companies or companies like Coca-Cola? And what will be the enforcement strategy to ensure that they are actually liable, take responsibility for what they do with respect to finances? Because if it is with respect to legal aspect, court actions, we know what to do. And the next concern is with the sources of finances. You made mention of the global sources. Is there any contemplation related to common but differentiated responsibilities, given the fact that the global, not the industrialized countries, are doing big business with respect to plastics, while the downstream, especially Africa, at the consumption level, is bearing much of the brunt? Do we look at that one? And my last concern is with respect to the trust fund. The climate funds seem to be having a lot of hitches with respect to access. So what are we contemplating for the trust fund to be able to ensure that the vulnerable envisaged from what you presented will be able to access the fund and not having the difficulties that countries are currently having with respect to the climate fund? Thank you.
Okay, great questions. So I will take your last question first, on the access to the funds. So I think one of the most important parts of this new financial mechanism would need to be a sort of a secretariat architecture around that, that understands the convention, understands its objectives and the compliance, and the need for countries to produce country level plans, full program level plans on their plans to reduce plastic production to receive those funds. So it needs to be coordinated, and it needs to make more sense of it. So I think the only thing we can do is look at the way, for example, the Montreal Protocol does it, which is a very coordinated and strategic manner, and the funds are delivered year on year to ensure the implementation. So I think for me, the difficulty that we see at the moment is how many different pots of money, how many different ways to receive the funding. Whereas what the treaty could hopefully do with the financial mechanisms is make sense of all of this and bring it under one clear strategy. Going back to the point on common but differentiated responsibility, you're absolutely right. The CBDR is really the founding global principle, which it is what the provision of funding from developed countries to developing countries is sort of based on, really, is that view that there is common but differentiated responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities of the industrialized nations is to support the other countries to implement the agreement and receive this funding in such a way. So that principle, while some people find CBDR concerning, as they may say, for example, China shouldn't have a differentiated plastic reduction timeframe from Germany, based on CBDR. But based on CBDR, Britain should be providing funding to Uganda, for example. I don't know, as in that is the concept of CBDR that I don't think that is important. So those are your first two questions. I think CBDR is very important to this whole thing. On EPR, just to quickly say, EPR generally, I think a lot of people have looked at it and what global EPR would look like, and I think it's unlikely that a global EPR system could be set up. I think the plastic pollution fee is maybe getting as close as you could to that, but in terms of what the treaty will do about EPR, I think it will most likely provide guidelines on how to set up effective EPR systems and how to enforce them, and then also provide that capacity building and technical assistance for countries to then be able to implement EPR in their national jurisdiction. I think I don't think it's going to be able to create a kind of global system and global EPR system, and it's much more likely that it's going to be a kind of supportive role to support countries implement it within their national borders. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions, Justice. I hope I haven't missed one, but yeah.
Thanks, Jacob. I think that was a 3-in-1 there. So well done on taking that. And those were really integral questions as well. I'm going to have to unfortunately ask Ahmed if you could actually email me or send me your question via chat, so I can get it to Jacob. I think we are well over time and I wouldn't want to keep folks in any longer. So if I could just kindly ask you, Ahmed, just to share your question either on the chat very quickly.
I will be very quick.
I can answer very quickly, I don't mind.
Okay,
let me just
all right.
share the experience. I'm currently following finance at ICCM5, and it's quite unfortunate that a lot of countries, even including high ambitious countries, are blocking anything pertaining to finance, even though the tax was actually targeted at industries who are producing these chemicals. and they are justifying it, blocking it. I'm thinking that should be an experience to be carried over to plastic treaty, because this is definitely what is to be expected. I just don't know. I just think we just need to be well prepared for a very difficult negotiation when it comes to finance. And that's also now maybe think what we should be thinking about, maybe local finances, at least to support whatever it is, because I know this is going to be a bit difficult, just to share that, because every justification to ask for any new financial commitment is being blocked. And the German government just announced 10 million euro to support the new framework for this ICAM. And it's not just unbelievable the amount of things that I just don't want to use some word, but that's going on right now. So yeah, just saw something for information to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, for sharing with us your experience there. Much appreciated. I think we all recognize that we are going to have a tough fight on our hands as we go into the upcoming INCs. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think it gives us something to be aware of and keep on our radar as we continue to even analyze the zero draft and, strategize as to what CSOs want to really push for and make their governments aware of before the INC3. So thank you for sharing that with us. And just a huge thank you to Jacob for making the time to share such an insightful presentation around finance and the treaty. It is really an integral and a priority aspect for us in Africa. And I think the main message that was quite clear is our role as CSOs is identifying what should be funded and what obviously should not be funded. There's no doubt that Africa will agree for a dedicated fund, but the primary objective is really underpinning, is going to be underpinned as to what should be and what shouldn't be funded. So thank you so much, everyone, for making the time for today. I just want to remind folks that we have a 4th webinar coming up on the 5th of October. And that will be discussing procedure in multilateral environmental agreements with Andreas from CL. So thank you so much, Jacob, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. The recording and the presentation will be shared between now and tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.